Awesome. Zach, thanks for joining us. Um,
A pleasure, Adar.
you and I
Thanks
have,
for having me.
yeah, we've had quite a few conversations thus far, but I've generally moderated debates between you and another guy by the name of Zach. And it's about time we have one, just you and I, so here we are.
Let's rock and roll.
So the topic of today's debate is, should Israel be a Jewish state, essentially?
So it's a good question. Even does a Jewish state necessarily imply Jews would have privileges that non-Jews would not have? That's an interesting question. Apparently, some people on Twitter believe that you could be a Jewish state without granting Jews any additional privileges or rights that non-Jews wouldn't have.
That's true.
But I agree
Yeah.
with your framing. I
That,
do agree with your framing.
right. So just so there's clarity, when we mean most people would consider a Jewish state a state that has some kind of preference for Jews or protection for Jews. So let's go with that framing. That said, I would be interested in hearing those make the case of how it would still be a Jewish state without any law preferring Jews. I do have some ideas maybe we could get into, but just wanted us to be clear on the prompt. Should Israel continue to be a Jewish state, or should it be a Jewish state in the first place? So Zach, maybe you want to just start with sharing your position on that.
Yeah, well, I would start off by saying that I don't think my view on Israel is any different than my view on Pakistan or India or the United States or Mexico or anywhere else in the world. I think that if you're Pakistan and you say that Muslims should have more privileges or more rights than non Muslims, you end up with laws. And I just saw a post about this today where non Muslims are discriminated against, either in the legal system or in the judicial system or by the police or in the education system or in the healthcare system. The same would, of course, be true in a place like Egypt, where if Egypt defines itself as an Arab state or as a Muslim state, then all the non-Arabs or non-Muslims, such as the Nubians or such as the Coptic Christians, right, that they would also face discrimination. As soon as the state says we're going to privilege Arabs or Muslims in some way or another, then all the Coptic Christians, which are 10% of the population of Egypt, or all of the Nubians or sub-Saharan Africans who have various religions. So they're all going to face discrimination. Like I said, either it could be in any number of forms. It could be in property rights, in the education system, in the healthcare system, in the judicial system, etc. Obviously, the same is also true in Israel, where if you say it's a Jewish state, then the 20 some percent of the country that's non-Jewish, leaving aside the occupation, right? Let's just pretend Israel wasn't militarily occupying millions and millions of people, denying them basic rights for 56 years. But let's just pretend that doesn't exist. But even within the state of Israel, its borders from 48 to 67. If you say that it's a Jewish state, well, then obviously the non-Jews are going to face discrimination. Either their municipalities will be underfunded, or their schools will be underfunded, or they'll face police violence that Jews won't face. Oh, and the reality is, of course, all of the above. That has been the case for non-Jews in the state of Israel since 1948. And look, as an American Jew, so Jews are what, 2%, 3% of the total population of the United States. Obviously, I'm a minority group in the United States. So obviously, if the United States said, well, we're going to choose the religion of the majority of the 80% who are Christians, well, then what would that mean for me as an American Jew? Would it mean that in the judicial system, if I'm arrested, I'm going to face harsher penalties for committing the same crime as a Christian? Does it mean that does it mean that the police, when I protest, are going to use more violence against me than they would Christians? Right. So I would face all the same problems that Palestinians or other non-Jews would face in Israel. And obviously, for all of those reasons, I think privileging any category of people based on their identity at birth, right? Something that's they're not in control of, just some arbitrary identity, an ethnic, a religious, a national, a racial identity. If you say we're going to privilege one group over over all the other groups, well, then you're building a society on a fundamentally faulty foundation, a foundation of inequality and injustice. And obviously, I'm opposed to those things.
Awesome. Thank you. So before I take a deep dive, I just want to make it clear that neither of us are representing the mainstream Israeli position. So although we're going to have disagreements, somebody who's very traditionally on the pro-Israel side is probably not going to find a voice here that they strongly resonate with. So I just want to put that out as a disclaimer that me being an Israeli Jew and you being an American Jew, it doesn't mean we're covering anywhere near the broad spectrum of perspectives here. In fact, I would say you and I both are on, we represent what is currently a more fringe portion of the population that we would like to see become more mainstream. And despite that, we still have our fair bit of disagreements. So when it comes to, you wouldn't want to see any state have some kind of preference for one group or another. And in the ideal, I agree with you. I think, equality is important. I think it's a value that we should strive for. That said, I'm also not big into telling other people how to govern. At the end of the day, many countries in the world today are ethno-states that prefer their native population or people born there over new immigrants. I would say when it comes to Israel and Palestine, we actually have a unique situation where the 20% Palestinian population are not immigrants. They're native to that land. So I would say, while we have many examples of ethno-states, Israel is a unique example, not one that we can look at other examples as a reference point. It's wholly unique. Now, when it comes to the 20% of the Israeli population who are Palestinian citizens of Israel, them collectivizing and working towards achieving better rights within Israeli society, I think that's one conversation, and I'm not sure we're going to have any disagreement there. The reason for that is any discrimination against them or any inequality against them can be fixed without putting the 80% in danger. In fact, I would argue that the better the lives of the 20% are, the safer the 80% Jews living on the land are. So I don't think we have any disagreement there. I think probably our area of disagreement is what we do with the entire land, right? So you have this vision for you didn't mention this on this stream, but I have heard you mention it before, a secular binational state. Now, as somebody secular, I'm super cool with this concept. But yeah, do you want to interject something?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't really characterize my view as pro-binational state. I would probably say I'm actually quite indifferent as to however many states there are between the river and the sea.
Okay, cool. Sounds good. So maybe you didn't. Maybe I just assume that because that's the general anti-Zionist position these days. So I apologize if you've never said that. Now,
just to clarify the point, just to double click,
sure, yeah.
I'll give you the mic back in one sec. But my view would be that it doesn't really matter if there's one state or two states or three states or 18 states between the river and the sea, so long as each of those states treats all of its citizens equally. I don't care how many there are.
Okay. So I'd say that's probably what we should dive into next, because like we could get into the actual solutions and what it looks like. But currently you have a situation where when we look at solutions for the entire land, and we actually ask the people living on the land what they want, the majority of Jews living on the land want to live in a Jewish state that has some kind of Jewish nature and ensures the protection of Jews. Now, there's many variations of what that looks like, but that's generally what most Jews living on the land want. If you ask Palestinians what they want a Palestinian state for Palestinians, not a secular state, not a binational state. So currently, the majority of both populations, their vision for the land does not really include the other in any way that's fair or just. So I view us activists as having a challenge, on one hand, needing to listen to what the people on the land want and desire. On the other hand, recognizing that people in conflict generally don't have empathy towards one another, so their solutions generally are not going to take into regard the opposing population. But when it comes to Israel and the government today, even if they protect 100% of their citizens equally, the second, if they were to decide to grant citizenship to all people living on the land, there would be something, in a sense, beautiful and just about that, but at the same time, it would put the Jewish population living on the land in great risk. Now, we could debate the level of that risk. You might not think the risk is that great, but I would view that as a solution to the conflict that very well may lead to more bloodshed than we've seen since the start of the conflict. So not only is it hard for me to get behind a solution that I think would lead to violence, I also think it's very unrealistic for Israelis to consent to such a solution. The government is looking out for its people. The majority of the people would consider such a solution to be suicidal. So the only way to implement such a solution would be by force. So you'd need to force Israelis to do that. Well, that generally leads to violence. So I'm looking for solutions that are just for all people living on the land, and that neither side will need to be forced into. Because again, if you need to force a side into something, they'll likely respond to violence with violence. So that's generally how I like to look at this. I think it's a beautiful ideal for all of us to be living on the land and sharing the land together. I think we could achieve that within a few generations, but I don't think everybody being citizens of one country overnight after 100 years of conflict, two populations with immense amount of fear, hate, and mistrust with one another, now competing over political and demographic control. I think that personally would end in disaster. Do you agree with that sentiment, or do you think that you see that as a viable solution currently?
Well, I think you're talking about some potential state of future violence when, in fact, the world we live in today is one with a tremendous amount of violence, the overwhelming majority of that violence being perpetrated against Palestinians. So I think the first thing I would say in response to what you said is you're trying to prevent some future state, some future violent state of the world, but we're living in a very, very violent state right now, today, in which every single day in Gaza, you have somewhere between 50 and 150 people killed, almost all of them civilians. In the West Bank, you have probably 1, 2, 3 people killed every day, mostly civilians. In Israel proper, you have violence perpetrated against Bedouins in the south, against Palestinians in Jaffa and Lid and Akka and Haifa and in the Galilee. That violence comes in the form of a dispossession, where the state of Israel is actively working to ethnically cleanse the region's indigenous inhabitants. Those are the Bedouins. In October 2024, they ethnically cleansed a Bedouin village inside Israel and are threatening to do the same to dozens more in the south. So we're living in a world in which there is already a tremendous amount of violence. So I don't know, that is just the first thing to say in response to some theoretical state of violence in the future.
Right,
but I think
just on that point, but you would agree with me that like most of our area of agreement is that we both are anti-violence and understand that there's better ways to solve a problem. So we both agree that violence is bad. So the violence occurring today, we're in agreement with. I would like to find a solution that doesn't lead to a different form of violence in the future, right? Because we recognize violence to be bad.
Yeah, so I think when thinking about some future state of the world, of Israel-Palestine, where there will be much, much less violence, I would look. I think the main point you made was that if you try and force the parties, especially Israel and Israeli citizens, to accept some version of a state that they would not want to accept. Mm-hmm. I think there are many similar cases in history where we could look to and ask ourselves, okay, when a population was forced to accept equality, right, to give up the privilege that they had, give up the supremacy that they had. We could look at apartheid South Africa. We could look at the American South. Let's just focus on those two. Of course, if you asked a white South African in 1989, what's going to happen if the apartheid regime falls? Well, they would tell you the same thing that you just said, right? They would tell you that, it's going to be violent. We couldn't possibly live with these people. They're incredibly violent. They're going to kill us all. And that was a rhetoric coming out of the white apartheid South African community in the years leading up to at the end of apartheid. And they didn't give up their privilege voluntarily. They were forced to, right? There was immense amount of pressure. The UN passed many resolutions banning weapons sales to South Africa. The only two countries that ignored the weapons bans were the United States and Israel, by the way. But eventually, there was so much pressure. There was a massive boycott movement, a massive sanctions movement. And eventually, the regime was forced to capitulate. not because it wanted to, not because it thought it was in its best interest. On the contrary, it was very worried that at the end of the apartheid regime would lead to more violence. But of course, and this is not to paint the post-apartheid South Africa picture as some type of, la la land where everyone lives in peace and harmony and security. No, of course not. It has tremendous problems, in part owing to the decades-long apartheid system that led to tremendous inequality and tremendous violence. And of course, apartheid South Africa is still feeling the effects of that. But nevertheless, at least you could say the system is not fundamentally unjust and unequal. The system is no longer creating the kinds of violent interactions that were taking place between white and black South Africans as it was during the period of apartheid rule. Same is true in the United States, right? If you ask any American from Mississippi or Alabama in the 1950s before the Civil Rights Act, they would tell you, well, my gosh, we couldn't possibly grant these people equal rights because they're violent, they're rapists, they're gangsters. They're gonna rape our women and they're gonna kill us all and steal our homes because they're angry after hundreds of years of persecution and Jim Crow and slavery. How could we possibly grant these people equal rights? They're gonna kill us all. What, again, they didn't voluntarily give up the privilege they had; they were forced to. It was a Civil Rights Act of 1965, and it was the senators and the representatives from the southern states, of course, rejected it. But the law passed anyways. They were forced to accept equality. Equality, it's very rare in history. It's not to say it never happens, but it's extraordinarily rare. We're a population of people who enjoy benefits and privileges and extra rights relative to the people around them, the people who are living side by side, their neighbors. It's very, very difficult for them to give up power, give up privilege voluntarily. No group, almost never, will do that voluntarily. They're forced to do it by some external power or some external body or some amount of pressure that makes the cost of the privilege and the power unbearable. And ultimately, I think that is what will have to happen in Israel, because Israeli Jews are not going to want to give up the power and the privilege that they have. And so ultimately, there will need to be some amount of pressure, and they will need to be coerced to do things that they don't want to do. And I think, just to illustrate the point, 95% of Jewish Israelis in January 2024, the percentage has come down since, but in January 2024, well into the genocide, right? We're talking, at this point, some 30,000 Palestinians had already been killed officially, many, many more unofficially. 95% of Jewish Israelis were of the view that the Israeli government and the Israeli military were either using the right amount of force in Gaza or not enough force in Gaza. And today, there's still widespread support in Israel for the war. Of course, there are many people who are now who care more about bringing home the hostages than they do about sending Gaza, completely destroying the entirety of the Strip and killing all of its people in it. But yes, there's still widespread public support for the war, and I think all of us in this room, I would certainly hope, believe that the war needs to end, and it cannot go on. The hostages need to come home. The Palestinians need aid. They need they need clean water. They need shelter. They're freezing to death. The war needs to end. Everyone, I think, basically, I mean, if you think the war should not end, I'm sorry, you're just, I don't know what to say. Like, there's nothing to really talk about with you, because, you don't consider Palestinians as human beings if you think the war should continue. You also apparently don't consider the hostages human beings either. So anyways, all of that is just to say that equality is rarely something that that the people with power and privilege are rarely going to give it up without that pressure that you yourself said is going to lead to violence.
So I actually agree to a large extent about people not giving up their rights or supporting equality unless pressured. I don't think, you brought up two examples. I think the South African example is more accurate because we're talking about one population controlling another and that other eventually getting equal rights. American civil rights movement would be more similar to the 20% of Palestinian citizens of Israel working towards improving their rights. But I don't think South Africa is an example that should inspire hope in this future, because, as you mentioned, South Africa is not a case study where it actually turned out well. You have a decreasing white population in South Africa. So Israelis look at the South African example and they say, why would we ever want to create a situation that will cause our society to be but by whatever measure we want to look at, worse, causing the population to leave, right? Now, you gave an example of how pressure caused them to make changes, but Israelis are never going to willingly consent to a solution that will put their lives in grave danger. So if they view the solution to be one that will destroy Israel, then you'll need to kill them before they would agree to that. If you're simply fighting for a change in policy that can still ensure Jews on the land being safe, then it wouldn't require all too much pressure. It's all a question of what we're trying to achieve, right? So if we want to put pressure on Israel to end the occupation in the West Bank, right, or pressure Israel to work towards two states, or really any variation of a solution that won't give Jews the feeling that they're going to be destroyed, that's a solution in which pressure would work. If the pressure is to dismantle the state, then Jews would just rather die fighting than agree to something like that, right? So,
just to clarify, who's arguing for the dismantlement of the state? I mean, I'm certainly not arguing for that.
Well, I mean, today it's become one of the more popular opinions amongst Western social justice activists who are calling for the full dismantling of the state, as well as the majority of the Palestinian population today. That is the primary position amongst Palestinians and many of their supporters in the West. And I can understand it, right? If I was Palestinian and my land got taken by these outsiders and they built their own homeland on it, I would want to fight until that entity no longer existed. So I'm sympathetic with the struggle, and I can understand the stubbornness to not agree to any form of Israel. I just don't really see any way in which that was going to lead to a viable solution and peace on the land. So I try to ground my solutions not just in like the ideal of what I want to see happen, but also I try to be deeply pragmatic and like what is just for both people and what can we actually implement. So if the pressure is for Israel to reform, I think that will work. In fact, Israelis are very self-critical, right? We've had record levels of protest to reform the government, but Israelis are not going to protest to destroy themselves if that's what they believe the mission is. So I believe the framing of the framing and the approach of that activism is ultimately what's going to determine if it's effective. I think while you pointed to an example of pressure working, we have other examples where pressure does the exact opposite. You have like North Korea, where the fact that they're sanctioned and pressured by the West only makes them more nationalist and more supportive of their government, right? So I would say it really comes down to the type of pressure and what the end goal is. If the end goal is one that both populations will consent to, we're much more likely to achieve our goals.
I would say a few things. First of all, on the comparison to North Korea, I think that's a bad comparison because Israel, within the 48 to 67 borders, is relatively democratic. Those democratic freedoms have been eroded over the past few years, especially with the rise of the Netanyahu, Smotrich, Ben Gvir government. But you could say that in the case of North Korea, the extra you pressure the state of Israel, the people are gonna protest. The people are gonna rise up. Whereas this is not the case in North Korea. So external pressure just can't possibly have the same impact, right? So I don't think that it's a good analogy, but I would say that I think the main thrust of the point you were making earlier is that the Israelis are never going to accept a solution where they feel like it's going to lead to their erasure or violence against them or their destruction. But I think the problem is those things are all happening right now to Israelis, right? Every single day in Gaza, you have 1, 2, 3 soldiers killed. The same was true in Lebanon until relatively recently. The same is true in the West Bank, where you have Israeli soldiers facing violence. Israelis, and then of course you have terrorist attacks where Israeli civilians are targeted. So I would say that the idea that some future state may potentially possibly lead to some amount of violence is sort of ignoring the fact that right now there is a very violent state of affairs for Israelis, maybe not violent enough. I mean, maybe the problem is there isn't enough violence against them now, so they don't feel any pressure to change things. And I'm not obviously advocating for violence against Israelis. On the contrary, I'm opposed to violence. I would be opposed to really any. I mean, it's not that I'm a pacifist, but I would say that I would always prefer nonviolence to violence, both for Israelis and Palestinians. But I think that this general idea of this fear that some future state of affairs is going to be very violent. Have you not been paying attention to what is happening in the country for the past? I mean, we could go back to October 7th. We could go back to the Second Intifada when 1,000 Israelis were blown up in cafes and buses. Was that, are Israelis, did they just want to continue to live a life where they're constantly subject to violence because they're perpetrating 100x more violence on Palestinians? I mean, is that a state of affairs that they're okay with? And ultimately, I mean, I don't know what you would say to that, but I guess I'm curious from your point of view. Like, is there already not so much violence, and is that violence not worth trying to solve for?
So, I think the way most Israelis view it is that yes, there's violence, but we're still in charge. We're still in control. We're still able to control our own destiny, and this is the violence that just comes with us living in a hostile region. We're still here. We're still winning, as opposed to a violence that leads to the eradication of Jews living on the land or the destruction of the state. So this perceived scale of the violence is vastly different. Where I agree with you completely is the status quo in its current form is not only immoral, it will always lead to more violence. And the only way for Israelis to ensure that they can continue to live on the land is through peace, right? There's no better security than peace. This is something that I really would like my fellow Israelis to understand. But Israelis recognizing that there's no better security to peace doesn't mean any quote unquote peace solution is then going to be favorable or lead to long-term, like a peace solution might actually not lead to long-term peace. So I agree. What's that? So for, oh yeah, you're muted, or I can't hear you. Maybe audio setting. 2025 still got these technical difficulties, huh?
I'm with you. I'm back.
Okay, cool. You commented on something I said about a peace agreement, a quote-unquote peace agreement. So for example, if it's as many people envision it today, it's secular binational state. And again, this to me is a beautiful ideal. I just don't think it's realistic. But let's say we implement that. That's a peace agreement that very well might lead to violence, right? So Israelis need to understand the status quo is unsustainable. And if they want to ensure their survival on the land, that comes through peace. But yet that doesn't mean that any peace agreement is ultimately going to be good for them, right? So on one hand, it's drilling in this notion that you and I both agree on, that we need to change the status quo, but also having viable options on the table that both sides, that will be just for both people. And it being just for both people is not only the right thing to do, it increases the chance of it being accepted by both populations. So it's doubly important that this is a just solution.
Absolutely.
That wasn't hard for us to find common ground. We might. It seems like you're a little bit. Yeah. What were you gonna say?
Well, look, I was just gonna say that I think when you look back over the past 20, 30 years, and you look back at kind of when do the major flare-ups and violence occur, they usually occur when one or the other party breaks some kind of some ceasefire that was sort of in place prior. I think the first major case the first major case this happened was in November 2008. And for about the period of about 6 months prior to that, you recall that was it early 2008. Israelis and Palestinians, Hamas and Israel signed a ceasefire agreement, which was broken in November. Was actually broken on 2008 when Barack Obama was elected president, November 5th. Israel loves to carry out, break ceasefires, announce ethnic cleansing plans, mass murder Palestinians. Whenever there's some other big event happening in the world, this acts as a perfect distraction. This happened on November, was it 5th or 6th, 2008. They broke a 6-month ceasefire and then within a month there was the violence escalated to what was at the time the most violent period in the entire history of the Israel-Palestine dispute to date, or at least going back many decades between Israelis and Palestinians. The 2008-2009 war cast lead, in which Israel killed more than 1,000 Palestinians, overwhelmingly civilians. The Goldstone report came out with a 300-page report after the war in which they determined that Israel's goal during the operation, and I'm using their language now, was to terrorize the civilian population of Gaza. That was the goal. They investigated something like 11 strikes in which Israel killed innocent civilians and determined that in 10 out of the 11 strikes, there were no military targets identified, that it was a campaign of mass murder. Now, and you could say that sort of set the stage for the next 14 years to come, which when we saw the 2014 war, and then the 2021 war, and obviously the most recent war. In each of those cases, well, in the most recent case, you could say it was Hamas that broke up the ceasefire, although there wasn't really a ceasefire, right? In the weeks leading up to October 7th, Israel was slaughtering Palestinians in the West Bank and in Gaza. There were a dozen-some casualties in the previous weeks. So there wasn't a real ceasefire. But again, it was the same problem.
Just to build on that, 2023 was the deadliest year for Palestinian children prior to October 7th, if I recall. Something like that. Yeah, right, okay.
So, I think what you saw was that these ceasefires, like, to the extent that they were, that both parties, they kept their part of the agreement, that these were sort of, they worked in the sense that they prevented some amount of violence. I mean, even just look at Oslo itself. Oslo was the culmination of the first Intifada, during which time, about 180 or so Israelis were killed during those 6 years, from 87 to 93. About 1,100 Palestinians were killed. But what happened after the signing of the Oslo Accords is the violence dramatically went down, because you had an agreement, because you signed an agreement. And over the course of the next 7 years, you saw fewer Israelis and fewer Palestinians die over the course of the next 7 years as you saw over the previous 7 years. Even though Oslo was a failure in many respects, again, it did in fact reduce the violence. Same was true in the 2007-2008 ceasefire agreement. There was another ceasefire agreement that was about to be negotiated in 2012 when the second in command in Hamas was handed a draft of a peace agreement that was expected to be approved by him. It had effectively, it seemed like it was going to get approved by the Hamas leadership. What did Israel do a few hours after Ahmed Jabari, the second in command, and Hamas received that peace agreement in, was it November 2012? A few hours after he had a draft of the agreement, Israel killed him. Within a month, there was another war in which 140 some odd Palestinians were slaughtered, mostly civilians. So again, I'm not trying to justify, legitimize 56 years of occupation or 15 years of siege and blockade. No. But what I'm saying is that ceasefire agreements, peace deals, tend to lead to less violence. That is sort of the nature of those agreements. Look at what happened. I mean, again, same with the Israel-Hezbollah war that we've just been witnessing that, is probably going to get reignited again. Why? Because they signed a ceasefire agreement that Israel completely ignored, by the way. Hundreds and hundreds of attacks on Lebanese civilians have continued since the quote-unquote ceasefire agreement was signed. But still, Lebanon has experienced much less violence. Many fewer Lebanese have been killed. Many fewer Israelis have been killed since that ceasefire agreement was signed. We should celebrate that. Death is wrong. Death is bad. Killing is wrong. We should celebrate ceasefire agreements. We should celebrate peace treaties, even though in the history of the past 30 years of this conflict, they've continually failed to actually be sustainable. But nevertheless, they tend to lead to a reduction in violence in the short term, if not the long term. So I'm always going to support them. I mean, the number one thing that will lead to an improvement of the situation in Gaza is a ceasefire. You need to stop dropping the bombs. You need to get humanitarian aid in, and that requires a ceasefire. I don't care about Hamas's pride. I don't care about Israeli military pride. Just let in the goddamn water and food and shelter. I mean, it's just so easy. It's so simple. People need to just give up on their political ambitions and just let people live. I mean, it's as simple as that.
Yeah, and just to build on one point and maybe play devil's advocate on another, most of our neighbors we're now in relatively peaceful relationships with as a result of negotiation. So what I find interesting, and I imagine this is a result of, a traumatized population and a conflict, a population that's been in conflict for 100 plus years, but most Israelis are very much convinced that force and violence is really the only way to solve our problems. When we look around, most of our problems have been solved after there was some violence, but then through a negotiation process. We didn't need to destroy Egypt in order for Egypt to for us to have an agreement with them. The same with Jordan, the same with UAE, now Morocco, maybe Saudi Arabia. The fact that the PLO transformed from the PLO to the Palestinian Authority, right? The PLO used to be more extreme than Hamas. Now they're the PA, which recognized Israel's right to exist in '89. We should be able to point to all these things as as examples of negotiation being highly effective despite it not yet solving the conflict. So I do agree with you, it's been effective in many regards. It's just we still haven't been able to negotiate the conflict to completion, which I guess has caused many Israelis to lose hope. But when we actually look at the situation, we do see that negotiation has been effective and has been beneficial for all parties involved. All party aside from like the extremists that don't want that peace. Now, you mentioned that we should all be against ending the war, and that's not an area of disagreement between you and I. I also think the war should end. If I'm to present the Israeli case as to why it should continue, and I'm presenting this because I think it's important for people to understand. Well, first, there's just this idea that the second we leave, Hamas will regain control of Gaza. So it's rather to keep the war going so we could continue to fight them and maybe even defeat them one day, right? There's still idea that they could be defeated or entirely destroyed, that they're so close to surrendering. And a lot of this is a result of how Israel is framing their progress, right? We've been hearing now for 6 months that they're almost defeated, they're almost surrendering. We keep hearing this narrative. So in many Israeli minds, they're like, wait, we just sacrificed 600 of our own just to end it? No, we're already so far. We need to continue. We need to control Gaza. We can't let them regain control. So I think there's an actually, I understand where that position comes from, and it's not as simple as them being like, oh, we just want to keep killing Palestinian civilians. It's just they actually want to see, they don't want all the death and destruction to be in vain, primarily of their own. So continuing they view as a better strategy than to end it now.
Yeah, I mean, if you believe those things, I think you've probably you've probably been brainwashed, because the reports coming out of Israeli media, by the way, I think it Channel 12 or 13, the Israeli media is reporting that Hamas is able to recruit more fighters
True.
than fighters are being killed. That is to say that for every one fighter that Israel kills, they're able to recruit two. I'm making up those numbers, but you get the idea.
That's what happens when you destroy people's families. They become radicalized.
We were all saying this already a year now. I mean, I was saying this on October 9th, right? I mean, it was obvious. As soon as Israel started just obliterating Gaza in those first few weeks, we had 15,000 Palestinians killed within a month, I think, if I recall. It was just absolute destruction. And it was very obvious already from those first few weeks that this is going to ultimately benefit Hamas in the long term, because when you create conditions of life, when you create a situation on the ground in which you've destroyed all the housing stock, you've destroyed all the schools and the universities and the hospitals and the churches and the mosques, when you've destroyed everything, you've destroyed all the civilian infrastructure, you leave people hopeless. When they're hopeless, they want to fight back. And that's exactly what we've seen, which is, and even if you look at the resistance reports coming out of that Hamas and Islamic Jihad are publishing, it's not obvious they've really lost. I mean, clearly, like, they're not firing rockets to Tel Aviv in the same way they were on October 7th, but their ability to attack the Israeli military in Gaza, right? We're talking about soldiers in Gaza, seems to have be just as strong now as it was a year ago. It is not obvious when I look at the resistance videos that they've actually really suffered any real military defeats at all. I mean, they're carrying out complex operations, ambushes, 3-4 stage ambushes where they have a spotter, a cameraman, Hamas units coming out of tunnels. They're doing this in December 2024. I mean, it's not really clear they've actually degraded or weakened their military capabilities at all. I'm not saying they haven't lost many fighters, but they've replenished them. I'm not saying they haven't used up a huge percentage of their munition stock, but they're clearly able to produce new munitions.
Right.
Right.
The fact that they're still able to shoot
just,
rockets is an interesting data point. I think there was like a good 4 to 5 months where not a single rocket was shot, but this past week there was a rocket shot almost every day, and specifically it was shot from northern Gaza, where our primary operation currently is. So it's almost their way to flex, be like, look, we could still shoot rockets from here.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's and you're talking about rockets fired into Israel, but they're firing mortar rounds into the Netzarim corridor on a daily basis.
Right.
So if you're Israeli soldiers sitting in the Netzarim corridor, that they keep expanding it, right? But it's 6, 7, 8 kilometers wide, stretching the entire width of the Gaza Strip, which divides northern Gaza from central and southern Gaza. Those soldiers are facing daily rocket mortar attacks.
Correct.
Like Hamas is, and you think these rockets were rockets that Hamas made on October 6th, 2023, or in September 2023? No, there's compelling evidence to believe they're able to manufacture new weapons, new mortar rounds, new sniper rifles. Again, what I'm and in addition to that, they're able to recruit more people, obviously, who wouldn't want to join Hamas if you're a 17, 16, 18, 21-year-old kid in Gaza whose entire family has been blown to bits. Of course, it's probably never been easier for Hamas to recruit fighters in the history of its organization. So if you're of the belief that you can destroy Hamas through military means, you're delusional. You're just not paying attention to what's happening on the ground. You're not reading the resistance reports. You're not following the Israeli casualty counts. You're just not paying any attention at all.
Yeah, I would agree. Like in my estimation, we would need to continue fighting for many more years, and even then we would leave and they would just rise to power, kind of like the Taliban in Afghanistan. After 20 years of U.S. presence, the U.S. wasn't able to defeat the Taliban. And you want to talk about disparity of power. There's an even greater disparity between the U.S. and the Taliban than there is Israel and Gaza, and even they were, for the most part, ineffective. So yeah, the question is, do we want to continue to sacrifice our hostages, sacrifice more of our own, kill more Palestinian civilians, continue the international isolation, only to maybe one day defeat them, right? That's generally how I look at it. So there's a certainty that there's a certain amount of things we can know for certain, only to maybe achieve a goal further down the line. What I will say, the way it seems many people are thinking about it, they think that eventually the toll will be so great that eventually they'll surrender. I think they're looking at like Japan. They use like World War II as an example, and it's also how they justify the amount of destruction. They say, yeah, we dropped nukes on Japan, and it ultimately saved lives. I personally think those are bad comparisons for many reasons. One, we've made immense progress since World War II, and we've created international law to avoid just that from happening. So I don't think that just because they did that effectively doesn't mean you can do it. That's more on a legal and moral level. But even as a strategy, I don't think these are comparable examples, because Palestinian population has a much stronger relationship to martyrdom than any of these other two entities. So for them, death is I don't agree with the Western framing that they like when their people die, but they accept it as a natural part of this process. So bring it on. If 100,000 Palestinians need to die, but that will liberate Palestine, we'll take that sacrifice. So I think that alone changes the dynamic significantly. And I also think at the end of the day, these are a group of people that are fighting for their rights, and it's hard to see them just giving up on until they achieve some kind of solution. And where I imagine you and I will also agree is one of the biggest mistakes Israel made was not give a nonviolent outlet for reform, right? So I think Hamas is, I would have rather them spend their billions of dollars building infrastructure in Gaza rather than tunnels and weapons, personally. And I think that is a choice they made that it's why I hold them complicit in the mass killing of Palestinian civilians, because they chose violence as their approach. But it's not that Israel gave clear means for Palestinians to achieve their goals that are nonviolent. In fact, we've seen also attacks against nonviolent Palestinians or nonviolent organizations like BDS. So when there's an attack against nonviolent activism, all that does is make the stronger case for violence. So I fully acknowledge that Israel has created conditions that are almost certainly going to produce violence, and that's something that needs to change. But with that, that does not thereby say that violence is the only response. So it's kind of complicated. I'm not trying to put blame. I'm trying to acknowledge how both parties are very much responsible for the situation we're in, and both parties can do a whole lot to change the situation. And I'm not even talking about the people. I'm talking about the governments. They can drastically change this, and they've both chosen the path of violence.
I would just make one comment on what you said, which has to do with Hamas's Hamas's allocation of resources to building tunnels, to weapons, to munitions, to etc. I think we have to be consistent here, and so if we say that, Hamas is responsible for directing its resources towards construction of tunnels rather than, I don't know, I mean, they can't export or import anything, so I'm not really sure how what kind of economy they can really build. But then we would also have to say then, the Israel's the amount of money that Israel spends on its military installations is also we would have to criticize that as well, right? Because of all the top 25 countries in terms of GDP per capita in the world, Israel has, I think, maybe the highest rate of poverty of any of them. And that's because you have a huge percentage of the population which is living below the poverty line. We're talking primarily the ultra-Orthodox and primarily the Arab population. Their schools are underfunded. Their infrastructure is underfunded. The Bedouin villages are not recognized, so they cannot build schools. They cannot build roads. They cannot build proper infrastructure. They don't get bus service, etc. And why? Why is that? Well, because Israel spends more money per capita on its military than almost any other country in the world, save for the United States. So if we're going to criticize Hamas for directing its resources to military spending rather than infrastructural development for the civilian population, well, then we would obviously have to level that same accusation against Israel. So again, I just would say we have to be consistent.
Yeah, so I would say yes and no. Yes, in the sense that I would like Israel to invest a lot more into peace than they do into not just investment of like financial investment, but also like an investment of thought and time into solutions rather than just maintaining the status quo. So I do agree with you. Our focus on militarism rather than peacemaking is something I'd like to see shifted. That said, I don't see them as comparable for the reason that Hamas military capabilities are not keeping Palestinians safe. They're just not. That's not the purpose of their military. If the purpose of their,
obviously disagree with that.
Well, if the purpose of, but if that were the case, then they wouldn't. They would build tunnels. The purpose of the tunnels would be so civilians can hide in there against bombardments. That's how they would keep their people safe. These are tunnels for their militants specifically to be able to get around and launch attacks against Israel if Israel decides to invade. So yeah, you could say them as the government of Gaza have the right to attack an invading force. That's true, but that's not the sole purpose of their military and military activity. You can't say the same thing about Israel. If Israel didn't have a military, then the Jews would not be able to live on the land. If Palestinians didn't have Hamas, their lives would be better because of it. So I just don't see them as comparable things.
I mean,
and I know I'm getting very close to one of those shitty Hasbara talking points, but I think there's something important to understand here.
Well, this is a common talking point. This is a common trope that I mean, and so I think the point you're making is like it's hard to maintain military occupation and it's hard to besiege a population if you don't have a military. That is obviously correct. Israel could not besiege 2 million Palestinians if it didn't have a military. Israel could not uh, uh, impose a violent military occupation on 3.5 million Palestinians in the West Bank without a military. That's obviously correct.
Well, so certainly, and that would be an area of agreement that what Israel does with its uh, military rule over the West Bank, what it's currently doing in Gaza, is not what the military should be used for. But needing a military that
I mean,
could protect its
like
people
the,
is essential. And I could hear the case saying we could cut military budget down by 30% if we just have it be a defensive military, not an offensive one. But it's just not comparable.
but I think this idea that I think the opposite of what you said is much closer to the truth historically, right? So think of how did the Zionist community in Palestine prior to 1948, how did they create a state? Um, they realized that their presence was unwelcome because they weren't interested in integrating with the local population. They were interested in controlling it. And they were interested in imposing a Jewish entity, a Jewish state, on top of an existing population rather than integrating with the existing population. And in order for them to achieve that, they realized very, very early on, I mean, the Haganah really, I mean, it really dates to 1921, but and the Haganah being the predecessor of the Israeli military. But even you could say it goes back to these watch guards, which were already present in 1905, 1906. But they realized fairly early on that their presence wasn't welcome. Why? Because they had no interest in integrating in Palestine. They had interest in controlling population of Palestine and creating an exclusively Jewish society where Jews would derive the benefits, where Jews would get special privileges, where where new towns would be built for Jews, where a healthcare system would be built for Jews, where a labor union will be built for Jews. I mean, the Histadrut didn't allow non-Jews in until 1961. And so the whole system was built exclusively for Jewish benefit in a land that was overwhelmingly non-Jewish. And what the Zionists realized was that the only way for them to actually implement this project was through force. They realized this already in the 1920s. It really came to a head in 1936 when Palestinians rose up against the colonial power, the British, who had imposed this violent rule against them and had completely ignored the democratic will of 85% of the local population. And so they rose up against it. And it was at that point that the Zionists realized, okay, this project is going to require force for implementation. So in Israel, so when you're saying like, and that trend you could just carry through all the way to the present day in 48 and 60, in 67, and you basically need it when you're imposing when you're a foreign community and you want to dominate a native population and establish an exclusively Jewish ethno state in the midst of that native population that is irrelevant to the project. I mean, ideally they wouldn't even be there, but they're there, so we have to figure out what to do with them. Do we expel them? Do we make them second-class citizens? What do we do with them? And of course, you need a military when you're going to do all those things. And then the opposite. And then when you look at the Palestinians didn't have a military. There were these militias. There were bands of militias, but there was no Palestinian military. They didn't have an organized militia force because, I mean, ultimately they underestimated how ambitious the Zionists were, and they underestimated the backing that the Zionist community had. They had the backing of the British Empire, the strongest empire in the world. Then they had the backing of the Soviet Union and the United States, both of whom recognized Israel within minutes of its declaration in 48. And then they had the backing of France, and then they had the backing of the United States, the world superpower since 67. So, I mean, the Palestinians ultimately are the ones who, because they didn't focus on defending themselves, they didn't focus on building a military, they've been obliterated. They've been ethnically cleansed. They've been now they're facing a genocide, and it's all because they didn't focus on developing armed forces like the Zionists. So I think that narrative is really wacko and is just totally out of sync with the history.
So I don't agree that they didn't focus on building a military. I just don't think they had the same funds or means to do it like we did. So we outperformed them, we could say. And the fact that we were able to outperform them should be more of a reason why they should be wholly dedicated to more nonviolent forms of resistance. I would say that's even more of a reason. If you're that much weaker than the entity you're fighting, maybe try a different approach. So I don't like. I'm not sure it really makes the case that their approach is correct. Where I do agree with you is, had they had a strong military, they would have been able to defend their rights. True, but all we're doing now is recognizing the importance of a nation in conflict having a military to protect its rights. But when we look at the actual situation right now, take away all the oppression the Israeli military causes, right? We could cut that out. If you take out the rest, that's a defensive military that is ensuring that Jews can continue to stay on the be safe on the land. You don't have any.
Well,
there's no.
I would rephrase that. It's ensuring Jewish supremacy in the land. That is what the military is there for.
Well, you could say it also ensures Jewish supremacy, but its primary function is security.
To ensure that Jews have special rights, special privileges, that the state of Israel can guarantee Jewish safety and completely ignore Palestinian safety.
That's
the definition of Jewish supremacy. Sure. Jewish safety and completely ignore Palestinian safety. That's what the Israeli military is all about. That's what the Israeli police is all about, is ensuring Jewish safety. That's why they don't intervene with the Palestinians. When Palestinians kill Palestinians, basically it's irrelevant to them. They don't care about Palestinian safety.
Are you talking about Palestinian citizens of Israel when they commit violence towards Israel?
I'm saying
no, that's not
killing
true.
Palestinians inside of Israel. Israeli police. Without we care.
That's not quite true. Israeli police, it's true they're less active in a lot of these Palestinian villages. As of the past few years, the crime rate in these villages has increased significantly. There's been a movement within Israeli society to increase policing there. One of the tensions is they don't often want to be policed. It's a different culturally. It's like it's more of the clan. They're like, these are internal issues that we want to deal with. We don't want external police. There's actually debate within these villages as to what the best approach is.
This is just one example.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. But I just saying that the military is there to uphold Jewish supremacy. That's fine. But that's almost not. It's almost irrelevant to the point that I'm trying to make. Without the military, right? Without the military, Jews cannot remain on the land. That's just a fact.
Of course they can. They just have to. But I completely disagree with that framing. Of course, Jews can live on the land. There's no movement to expel Jews from the land. There's a movement for equality. There's a movement for equal rights.
Yeah, but Zach, that's not true. That might be true in some circles in the pro-Palestine university movement. When we talk to people living on the land, Palestinians are not shying their aspiration to rid the land of Jews. Treat
Palestinians equally at the negotiating table. Treat them equally by the police. Treat them equally in the education system. Give them equal access to the water that is under the West Bank and Gaza. I'm not talking about a specific policy here. I'm talking about writ large. The reason Israel needs a military is because Israel refuses to treat the reason Israel wouldn't need a military if it just integrated into this the region that it found itself in. If it treated Palestinians the same way it treated Jews, it would not need nuclear weapons. It would not need to have this required military conscription. It would not need to be sending soldiers off to die. The reason Jews are so unsafe is because the project itself was based on Jewish supremacy and a Jewish ethno-state, where Palestinians are irrelevant. At best, they're a problem. At worst, they need to be eradicated.
Right. Well,
and then that's the fundamental source of the problem. And if you solve that, then you'll solve all the downstream problems. And so this narrative that, you hear this all the time. If Hamas laid down their weapons, I don't know how people finish that sentence, so they'll just be eradicated is probably what will happen. But if Israel laid down, but the propagandists would say,
right.
If Israel lays down its arms, then it gets destroyed. Whereas the Palestinians lay down their arms, how did they finish that sentence? I don't even know.
No, yeah, I think that's a Netanyahu quote. It's
just not, but it's just total nonsense.
If Palestinians laid down their arms, we'd have peace. If Israel lays down their arms, there'd be no Israel. So as much as I hate,
It's just
I,
so
as
much
much as I hate
propaganda in that
a
sense.
Netanyahu quote, I actually think there is truth to that. The reason I don't think, though, it matters all too much is because that doesn't really lead us to what's next. People will often say that to be able to attribute blame. So they'll say that quote and be like, you see, so it's all their fault. And that allows them to further justify the harm they're causing that population. That's why I generally object to that line. But if we're going to have like just an honest conversation of the difference in dynamics, yeah, it's true. Israel currently, and you could say if they integrated, we could speculate as to what it would have looked like had they integrated. Um, that's just not what happened. Right now, we're after 100 years of an ethnic conflict where we have immense amount of hate. There's a desire for revenge slash vengeance. The idea that the military does not play an essential role in the security of Jews living on the land, I just don't think is grounded in reality. We could talk and we would likely agree on the excesses of this military and all the things it's doing wrong, which has actually been the primary focus of my activism as of late, right? Critique of Israeli policy and IDF action. But that doesn't take away from the fact that it still plays a fundamental role in keeping Jews on the land safe. Is it possible
Well,
that
I
they
think
won't be needed one day? Sure, but today they are needed for that security.
I cannot think of a single case where Palestinians laid down their arms that led to some positive outcome for them. That Netanyahu talking point that if Palestinians laid down their arms, there'd be peace. If Israel lays down their arms, they'd be eradicated. It's just fiction.
It depends what we
In
need.
every case, in every single instance in which Palestinians pursue nonviolent resistance, they're slaughtered.
Wait,
Absolutely
it's
slaughtered.
not.
Every single
Hold
case.
on.
Find me a counterexample. I can't think of one.
Wait, it's not Palestinian. It's not Hamas that's stopping Palestinians from being eradicated. That's the international community that won't allow that to happen. That's not Hamas ensuring that happens because they don't have the military means to stop that from happening.
I'm sorry. I just want to address this point that if this point of propaganda, which is that if Palestinians lay down their arms, there'll be peace. If Israel lays down their arms,
I don't. But
rest.
that's not. What I said was reminded you of that quote, but that's not the statement I'm making. I think that statement is fundamentally flawed because it tries to attribute blame to one side rather than mutual recognition and responsibility of what we could both do differently. And also,
Sure.
we will have peace. What do you mean by peace? Peace on our terms. So it's essentially saying we took your land, accept it, and then we'll just let you live here. That's the peace we're talking about. So I understand it's a bullshit quote. Yeah.
Peace for Israeli Jews, but slaughter and occupation and domination and lack of human rights and land confiscations for Palestinians. That's what they mean by peace.
Yeah, certainly not the type of peace that Palestinians would be okay with, right? So we agree there. But what brought us to that quote was just the idea that I actually don't view Hamas military action as essential, but I do view the need of some protective force for Jews living on the land currently as essential. Now that protective force happens to be the IDF. The IDF happens to be involved in a lot of things that are not essential for protection. So it gives this perception that it's all evil and there's nothing good that comes of it. But if we actually look at what it's doing aside from the maintaining an unsustainable status quo and the war crimes being committed, right? If we put that aside for a moment and actually look at its role to keeping Jews safe, I mean, I would just say that's undeniable. And Hamas does not play that equal role for Palestinians. They just don't. And this isn't about attributing blame. This is just grappling with reality.
Yeah, I don't. There's a lot to say about the use of force on the Palestinian side. You could certainly say that the Palestinian issue has never been more front and center than it had on the international stage, on the stage of global public opinion, than it is today. And that's because of violence. That's not because of nonviolence. In fact, the most significant nonviolent protest movement going back to the Gaza March and Return movement in 2018, 2019. During which time, Palestinians, beginning in March 2018, in the tens of thousands every Friday went protesting, overwhelmingly nonviolently, certainly unarmed. And there was slaughter, just absolutely slaughter. 256 Palestinians killed, over 200 some odd Palestinians killed over the course of the 14 months, from March 2018 until I think it was almost the following fall. And one day alone, on May 14th, 2018, Israeli snipers gunned down 61 Palestinians on a single day. It wasn't even the major headline in Israel, because it was the same day that Jared Kushner and Miriam Edelson and Sheldon Adelson were celebrating the U.S. Embassy's move from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And that was the main story. The fact that 60 Palestinians were slaughtered, just gunned down. We're talking medics, journalists, kids, targeted for death, executed, wasn't even the front page story. So, nonviolence just doesn't make the news. It doesn't bring the world to bear. It doesn't convince activists around the world and governments around the world and churches and synagogues and mosques around the world to act.
I think
it doesn't do it.
I think it all depends on the scale of that movement, because we have seen very successful nonviolent movements. We saw Gandhi in South Africa, MLK in the U.S. Even apartheid South Africa was primarily, not entirely, primarily nonviolent resistance. So while I do think Israel made a huge mistake by punishing moderates as well as extremists rather than rewarding moderates, the primary resistance, the primary form of resistance Palestinians have engaged in has been violent and non-violent. Is there a way where we can have a massive movement, Palestinian movement that's non-violent, and have that have global impact? I'm confident of that being the case. The trajectory or the path that Hamas at least decided to take was one of violence, and the way Israel decided to respond was one of violence. Which is interesting, right? If we, after the dust settles, imagine a hypothetical that we achieve two states, right? Palestine becomes a state, but that means they've also recognized the Jewish state. And this is a result of the past year of violence. Both Israelis and Palestinians can point to that and be like, you see, the violence worked. The Israelis will say us destroying Gaza got them to accept us. And they would say October 7th led... No, I'm saying that's how they will rationalize it.
They already have. I mean...
No, well, Hamas... Hamas does not recognize Israel.
Already in 1988, before Hamas passed its infamous charter calling for Israel's destruction, was open to peace with Israel. Mahmoud Ashar went to Tel Aviv in June 1st, 1988, presented terms for a peaceful resolution to the settlement. Total non-starter. The issue is not that Palestinians won't recognize Israel. It's that Israel refuses to acknowledge Palestinian legitimate rights. That is a right to return to the homes they were expelled from, a right to live free from military occupation, free from land confiscations. No Israeli government, past or present, not the right, not the left, has ever accepted that, and probably never will. And that's the fundamental reason why there's violence, is because Israel refuses to share the land. It refuses to allow the Palestinians, the people who were living there before they showed up, to live in peace and harmony with them. Israel wants to dominate them. And that's obviously unacceptable to the Palestinians. So as soon as Israel says, we're willing to let you live in the homes that we expelled you from, or live in the country that we expelled you from, we're willing to let you live your lives free from domination, free from Israeli settlement expansion and land confiscations and destruction of Palestinian olive groves, and then we're open to peace. And that's been the case going all the way back to 1988. There were peace offers made to Israel by Hamas leaders in 1996. In 2003, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, in 2012, and 2017, Israel rejects. I've written extensively about this. The fundamental issue here is actually not Hamas. I mean, that's one of the greatest myths that most Israelis believe in, which is that the problem is the Palestinians. They don't look inward. They don't understand that their rejection of basic rights, the right to return to your home that you've been expelled from, the right to live free of occupation, Israelis refuse to accept and acknowledge those rights. And that's the reason why that's the reason for October 7th. That's the reason why there's ongoing war and ongoing violence in the West Bank, and that will continue so long as Israel continues to reject acknowledgement of these basic Palestinian rights.
So some of these rights would likely lead to Israel being destroyed or Jews not being safe on the land. And I think that specifically right of return.
Which one?
Right of return.
Why? That's nonsense. I just don't accept that.
Well,
that's how you solve for the violence. That is the solution to the violence, not the cause of the violence.
For a few reasons, but I just want to.
The cause of the violence is they can't come back.
I'll circle back to this, but Hamas, for the most part, they've never recognized Israel's right to exist, and they explicitly say, even in their new reform charter, and I publicly give them credit for reforming their charter and making an effort. But even in the reform charter, they say explicitly on multiple occasions that they will continue the struggle until all the land is liberated. So even
the Likud charter says the same thing.
Well, no,
from the river to the sea.
That was the Likud charter from the 70s. But again, I'm not here to defend Likud.
Hey guys, sorry to interrupt, but we're going a little bit over time, and I just want to remind you guys that we should wrap things up and then get started in the after party so we can allow people who are listening in to join in.
Sure.
I also have to. We have to wrap soon because I need to bounce soon. So I have maybe 15 minutes left. So we should probably wrap.
So we will whatever. So I don't need to continue making this point. We'll give you the last word on that. To be continued. To be continued. So Beata, what do you want to do? We do a few questions and then open it up. What's your thought here?
Yeah, let's do like 5 to 10 minutes of questions that people have asked in chat, and then proceed to after party.
Sounds good. So Zach, you could see the chat on the top right. There's a bubble. You click it. If there's anything.
Oh, geez, I'm so sorry, guys. I haven't been paying. I didn't realize there was a chat.
Yeah, all good.
I'm sorry.
Ika asked, just curious, any Palestinians in the chat? Are there Palestinians here? I'm not sure.
There's a question about binationalism. Just a quick point on that, because you actually raised that at the very beginning of this debate. My view on binationalism is that, again, it fundamentally privileges the group over the individual. I think a state should always privilege an individual over a group. That's the basis of international humanitarian laws. That the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is about humans. It's not about groups. I think as soon as you start to place the rights of groups ahead of the rights of individuals, you get all of the problems that we're experiencing today. So that's why I'm not a binationalist.
Actually, I can ask the questions to you guys so you don't have to sort through.
Yeah. Let's do that. Easier.
Okay, so first, Jonathan asked, how comparable are the domestic situations between Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, and its civil war as opposed to Israel and Palestine in terms of the international community being able to effectively leverage diplomatic and economic pressure to coerce the Rhodesian government into a peace agreement?
I don't know enough about that conflict.
I also don't. Yeah. I'm not an expert on Rhodesia. I'm sorry. Okay. I can't speak to that with any authority.
Maybe next time we'll do a debate on Rhodesia. We'll just need a prep prior.
I guess you could answer a more broad question about how much leverage does the international community have over diplomatic and economic pressure?
Well, it was, by the way, in 1948, Israel was occupying basically North Sinai and parts of Gaza. And the top U.S. diplomat in Israel said to then Israeli Prime Minister Ben-Gurion in December 1948, he said, you have two options. You either withdraw from Sinai because that's illegally occupied territory, it's not yours, or we're going to call on our allies Britain to invade and prevent you from taking over Gaza and Sinai. Okay, that was 48. Israel tried to occupy Gaza in 48. They were forced out by the Americans. In 1953, after the Kibbutz massacre, in which the Israeli military slaughtered about 56 Palestinians, mostly civilians. I think actually all civilians. It was a massacre. The United States government told Israel, it threatened Israel, that it would withdraw aid and it would sanction Israeli leaders if it did that again. 1956. What did the United States do? After Israel invaded and occupied Gaza from November 1956 until March 1957, Eisenhower told then Israeli Prime Minister, was it Ben-Gurion or Levi Eshkol? No, I'm forgetting. He said, you have two options. Either we impose sanctions on you, or do you withdraw from the Gaza Strip? Pretty simple. Same thing happened with Begin in 1982 in Lebanon. He got the call from, was it Reagan? One phone call, it's all it took. He didn't even have to threaten. He just said, Please withdraw your troops from Beirut. The war ends now, after however many 5, 10, 15,000 Lebanese had been killed. So it's very simple. Like, pressure works when it comes from the world superpower. We just haven't been applying it in the past 15 months.
Yes, I would agree with Zach. I think the international community could play an essential role. In fact, they very well may be needed because people generally don't care about their enemy to nearly the same extent they care about their own. This is humans acting as humans otherwise do. It's for this reason why we cannot leave it to Israel and Palestine to figure it out, because neither side is really valuing the other to a degree which will lead to a just solution. Am I saying that there's no way they could figure it out on their own? No, but I think the chance of that happening is far less likely. The international community has the privilege of approaching this conflict from the perspective of all lives are of equal worth, something that countries struggle to do with their enemy. The international community has that privilege, and that is the approach we need to take to solving this conflict. And one of my realizations since October 7th was actually that the closer your ties are with the country, the more leverage you have over them. I never really thought about that, but it's actually important to think about. People say, why don't we just tell Hamas to release the hostages? Who here is their ally that will convince them to do that? What will be the cost of them not doing that? Do we sanction them? Do we stop their funding? They're already sanctioned and they're already not funding. They're already designated as a terror organization, right? So U.S. leverage over Hamas is close to none. Their leverage over Israel is immense. And the reason I say this is because I think it makes a good case for U.S. as a superpower wanting to have actually good ties with as many countries as possible and using their positive relationship to put pressure to get them to reform. I would say we could maybe find a good solution to like North Korea with something similar, and Cuba. Right? There's a lot of these conflicts that very much seem to be based on the result of we're going to sanction you and isolate you and you're just going to change. But in reality, that's not what's happening. But through building ties and relationships, you then have economic leverage, political leverage, and you can use that. So it really expanded how I view foreign policy in general and the benefit of superpowers having as many alliances as possible. And I think in reality, we see that the Israel is responding to external pressures. The ICC investigation caused them to take a higher degree of care. The reason why the prisoners were arrested for alleged gang rape in Sde Teiman, or the prison guards were arrested, was because of the ICC investigation. We saw instances where Israel took greater precaution in Rafah because Biden put pressure on Israel. So we're actually seeing the impact of both international law and of allies putting pressure. But I will say that the pressure the U.S. is putting on Israel is very minimal, and for the most part, the U.S. currently acts as an enabler, and currently an enabler of a massive amount of death and destruction to civilians. So I think Zach and I are, for the most part, in agreement here.
All right, cool. Thanks for answering that question. So the next one is from Nico, and he says, Zach agrees that equality should be forced, but disagrees with the war continuing. This doesn't make sense to me. If using his analogy, the U.S. South was only forced to accept what the nation enacted as laws only after their defeat in the Civil War. Continuing with this same thought pattern, the Palestinians would most certainly have to suffer complete defeat, as it has been done throughout most of history, or surrender to Israel completely for them to be forced to follow equality laws. And Zach reconciled this problem given his premise.
Well, Palestinians don't have jurisdiction over Israelis, so I'm not entirely sure I even really follow the question. I mean, in order for Palestinians to be forced to impose equality on Israelis, Israelis would need to be subject to Palestinian jurisdiction, which is not the case anywhere. There's no Israeli Jew subject to any Palestinian authority jurisdiction anywhere between the river and the sea. Zero. So it's the opposite is true. It's that if Israel is going to treat its Palestinian subjects equally, it needs to be pressured to do so. The opposite is just simply not the case. Is there a single is there a single Israeli Jew who's living under a Palestinian rule, either by Hamas or by Palestinian Authority or some other Palestinian entity? I don't think there is.
Yeah, maybe if I'm to try to understand the question, maybe it was that the analogy to the South doesn't quite work, but we could only, maybe what they're saying is we can only have equality for everybody if we can defeat Hamas and have full control of the land. Only then can we implement equality. But that's not, it's an interesting question because that's not Israel's intention, right? Israel's intention is not to destroy Hamas so everybody could be equal under the law. So yeah, I'm not sure I understand the question, but maybe they want to. People can hop on stage and
Yeah, Nico, would you like to respond? You can request to speak.
Yeah, request to speak, and
We can grant it to you.
Zach, you have 7 minutes.
Yeah, I don't have much time, guys. I could do maybe 10 more minutes, but then I really do need to go.
Sure. We'll get around to going.
Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Yes.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate the arguments from both of you. But Zach, I think to clarify my question, you had stated that even despite the South's apprehension to follow the equality laws of what the U.S. wanted, that you said they still had to follow those laws despite not wanting it. And so you were advocating for a forced sense of like equality laws despite the populace or the people's intentions or desires.
Yeah, so I think maybe to clarify my point, when you have a state that is imposing autocratic rule or apartheid rule, and the majority of people living in that state refuse to give up their privilege and their power, then you need an outside power to impose pressure on that state to give up power, to share power. I mean, that's a pretty simple point that I think, Adar basically just said the same thing with regard to U.S. pressure. The way you get Israel to change is by applying pressure, either through the ICC or through the ICJ or through withholding weapons shipments, etc. I mean, that is how you apply pressure. By force, apply pressure. Obviously, the United States can't really force Israel. It could invade Israel, right? But short of that, it can apply pressure, which is what I mean when I say force. Apply pressure.
Okay, thank you. I'll let someone else get a question answered.
Thanks, Nico. One thing I'll say, which we mentioned briefly, and maybe Zach on our next conversation we could talk about this. What I would like to help activism be more effective, and as I mentioned, if the goal of activism is the dismantling of Israel, it's going to be very hard to get Israelis to ever agree with that, and they will fight dying.
Totally agree.
Right.
Totally agree.
So I would like us to find a way to frame the end result as a way that both Israelis and Palestinians will hear and be like, you know what? I could get on board with that. And even if they're not fully on board, they're on board enough that pressure can make them meet in the middle, right? So I think if we really care about solutions, about solving the conflict, we need an emphasis on solutions that both sides will consent to, because that is our best chance of resolving this without more violence. So maybe we could do a deeper dive into that next time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Cool. It looks like there's a question on the Abraham Accords. Should we find that one?
Yeah, sure. I didn't see that.
Oh, do you want me to, Hashim, do you want to up on the...
Well, I think PJ's still here. PJ has a question saying, this discourse is unhelpful unless it has a clear objective. What is the objective? Just to have a conversation. It was framed as a debate. What is being debated? Yeah, it's a debate slash discussion. What is the goal? I think for all of us to get a better understanding of the conflict by hearing two varying perspectives, engaging in good faith despite their differences. I think there's an immense value in that. In the world we're living in today, where discourse on Israel-Palestine is dominated by personal attacks, bad arguments, and propaganda, I think there's a strong desire to see an actual good faith, honest discussion about this very complicated issue.
Yeah, I would underline that last point. I think most content you're going to find on Israel and Palestine, it would either be coming from people who are all pro-Israel or all pro-Palestine, right? So, you very rarely, or alternatively, you'll get the Piers Morgan version of it, where it's all in bad faith of just cross talk and shouting, and it is, I think, quite rare actually to see people who disagree, but nevertheless discuss and debate and try and arrive at some, it may not agree on everything, but just be able to have a healthy conversation, I think is ultimately is a good thing. So yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, and then on the question is what is being debated, I think there were a lot of subtopics that there were areas of disagreement that we talked through about, how you frame it, the need of military culpability, and all that stuff. So I hope you at least got something out of it. Hashim Shah's mentions regarding the Abraham Accords. My question on the Abraham Accords is, how does everyone think it will be taken forward? Because now we'll have more support with Trump's
second administration. Now, let me just say something about the Abraham Accords, which first of all, I think there's a great deal of misinformation about them. They were not peace accords; they were normalization agreements. A peace accord is something that happens after a war or a conflict or a military dispute. There was no military disputes between Israel and the four countries that signed this agreement with, right? So this was not a peace deal. This was a normalization. Why are these countries interested in Israel? UAE, Morocco, Sudan, and who am I missing?
Bahrain.
Bahrain, yeah, thank you. So the reason these countries are interested in Israel and signing a normalization deal is because they want Israeli spy tech. This is an economic deal. All four of those countries are autocratic. All four of those countries want Pegasus and other Israeli spy tech that will enable them to spy on their own citizens. Israel is the world's leader in developing this awful technology, honestly, just absolutely awful technology that is violating all of our privacy, that is making it easier for these autocratic regimes to clamp down on dissidents, on journalists, anyone who's speaking out about human rights violations happening in these countries. I mean, that's the reason. And the whole thing was framed as this, wow, the Middle East is moving towards peace. I mean, it's all bullshit. It's actually an agreement between autocratic states and a police state and an apartheid state to make it easier for the two to collaborate on how to prevent journalists and human rights activists from doing their work. That was what the agreement was all about. But go ahead.
Yeah, so, on that, I can understand why many Palestinians are not happy with the Abraham Accords, because it gives this perception that the Middle East is moving on without them. So I'm sympathetic to that. On the other hand, I think there's tremendous value here for the reason I mentioned earlier. These countries have greater leverage over Israel if they have relations with Israel. So I would like these countries to be involved in the peace process. Right, so imagine a situation where there's a lot of normalized ties in the Middle East between Israel and these other countries. If they use the fact that these ties are normalized with essentially, let's call it, knowing that there's a risk that a relationship agreement ends if Israel continues to do X, Y, Z, that very well could put pressure on Israel to reform. So I actually see, as long as these normalization agreements aren't done, and then there's zero interest in solving the actual conflict, then I would say it would be negative. But if these normalized countries are involved in helping solve the conflict, then I think it will ultimately be positive. And the impression I get, even though it's true they have for the most part been silent the past year, which is not a great sign, because if they're silent now, what will cause them to speak up? I still do see benefit to Israel having normalized ties with countries that are ultimately care about Palestinians and want to see a solution to that conflict. So I think it could play out well. It just really depends on how these countries decide to act with their normalized ties. Right, Zach, can you see a situation where it's actually net positive? Like UAE says, you know what, if you want to continue this trade, we need a two-state solution. Morocco does the
It's really
same.
hard to
Saudi.
imagine that because the agreements were signed in the absence of any kind of Palestinian-Israeli peace deal. The Palestinians basically were irrelevant to these four Arab countries. And then, like you said, I mean,
They might not
answered
care.
your own question there.
Right.
When you answered your own question, when you said, if not genocide and mass murder of literally hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, what would get them to sort of speak out and you know?
Yeah, that's fair. I was debating myself
try to-
there, you know?
Try to apply some kind of pressure. I mean, if not now, when? I mean, the answer is never. There's no, because they're not interested in the Palestinians. They don't care about the Palestinians. That's why they signed the agreement in the first place. They care about suppressing their own journalists and human rights activists. I mean, that, you know, and Israel's the pawn to help them do that. Do they have any love for Israel? No, they don't. They probably don't. I mean, to the extent that Israel has, you know, demonstrates military prowess and, you know, exerts its influence beyond its borders, sure, they think they're impressed by that. But do they have any lost love for Israel? No, they're just interested in repressing their own
for sure.
populations. I mean, that's what this is about.
Yeah, it's purely self-interested. Yeah, I would agree. So I would say
But guys, we should wrap. I could, yeah. But thank you guys so much for having me here. Adar, thanks for hosting, and for all of you for participating, and really appreciate it.
Thanks for joining, Zach. Until next time.
Thanks, guys.